What's up, happy fabricators? In this video we're going to be going over my 5 favorite chop saw tips to increase both accuracy and efficiency in the shop. So let's make sure that we have both our eyes and our ears on, and let's get started. Number 1 tip, cut your miters first if all possible. There are 3 primary reasons for this. 1, it's going to increase accuracy. If you've got a piece in your cut list that looks something like this, that has a straight edge and a mitered edge, it's going to be a lot easier for you to cut that miter off without having to take a measurement and measure back from the tip of your miter back to the flat. And in doing so, you'll have a lot less likelihood of wavering that measurement and making a straight dialed cut. Okay, so the second reason for cutting your miters first has to do with efficiency. Every time you have to switch your saw back from a miter to a straight cut, that takes time. Now you might not think that takes too much time, but let's just say it takes 20 seconds and you have a 30-piece cut list. After you do that 30 times, that's almost 10 minutes when you add all that up. So if you have the space to create the workflow and be able to cut your miter on your piece, set it off to the side, cut another miter, set it off the side, and then come back through and cut your straight pieces, you're going to be both more accurate and more efficient. And the third reason for cutting your miters first has to do with material consumption. Now the way you do this is going to vary between what size of material you have and what your cut list looks like. So if I find a center mark on this tube and I cut my miter across the center of that, and then I will be able to take those 2 pieces and cut my straights off. And doing that, we're able to utilize the max we can out of this piece because those miters are overlapping, and we would not otherwise be able to get 2 8.5-inch pieces out of a 16-inch piece of tubing. Okay, so miter saw tip number 2 is get a small universal spotlight to have on your saw. I like to use this little flexible magnetic LED one that I have here, and the reason being is even if you have good ambient light in your shop, and I like to cut on the inside of the saw blade if I'm utilizing the piece that is in the clamp. And as soon as you drop your saw down, it gets nice and dark in there because all your light is blocked off from the outside. The benefit of this little guy is I can snake it in here, turn it on, and as you can see I dropped that down and we still have good light to get in here and see where our mark is. So as you can see, this guy doesn't even get in the way of the saw coming down. I can position it out of the way, pull my piece back, load another piece in, and if for some reason I want to use it on this side of the saw, I can do that. I can flip it around and reposition it. Okay, so tip number 3. I think this is my favorite tip of all of them today. So what we're going to call this trick is the fence miter reference point. Now this trick is going to be applicable on all miter cuts, but it's going to be especially effective on your accuracy for your larger tubing or even wood that is going to have a radius on it. So something like this that doesn't have a sharp 90-degree corner. It's got kind of a long radius on this. Because of this radius, it could be difficult to get an accurate length on your miter. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say we have our piece of tube here and we need to put a miter right at the 41-inch mark. Now we've got our saw set up as a 45 and we're gonna set this guy in here. Now we're gonna bring our little LED in so we can see exactly where our mark is. And then traditionally we're going to bring our head down and sightline right down the saw blade. Okay, so where the problem comes in here is when you're sighting down that saw blade and looking for the apex of the edge of the tube and your mark to dial that in and hit your mark, because of this rolled radius, the edge of the tube that you see is not actually the edge of the tube. So as you can see with my straight edge here, when you're looking down the saw, where that tube breaks over is the edge that you're going to see. This is actually the edge of the tube, and there is about a 3/16 inch discrepancy there. So when I go to make my cut, as you can see, we overshot our cut by roughly 1/8 of an inch. So this illusion per se is going to be compounded depending on the radius and size of the tube. So what you're going to do is figure out your miter fence relationship for this saw and your tubing. First thing you're going to do is set your saw to whatever miter you're going to use and cut that factory end off. Now that it's cut off, you're going to take your tape measure and you're going to measure from the edge of your fence to the knife edge of your miter. So thankfully on my saw, it's an even 3/4 of an inch. So that's gonna make it real easy to remember and do the math on. Okay, so what this does is gives you something straight to reference when you're making that mark. So you can know that instead of sight lining down at an angle over the radius of a tube in a dark corner behind your saw, you can know that the desired length of that tube minus your fence miter difference is going to be right on. Now this is going to be different for every shape of tube and every saw, so you'll have to do a test cut to figure out. But for example, we will show you what we mean by this. So now that we've got 2 miters on this piece, so we don't have the opportunity to cut all our miters first and have the accuracy of our straight cut. We have to have a miter on both sides of this. Let's say that I want a 36-inch miter to miter cut. Now I know that my miter to fence reference distance is 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to subtract 3/4 of an inch from that and make a mark at 35 1/4. Now when we go to load our material into the saw, we can line our mark up straight on with our fence from a straight on perspective. It's going to minimize the chance of mistakes. Run our tape across and we are dialed at 36 inches. And that is why I love that trick. It has definitely increased my accuracy. It just allows you to get a straight on perspective versus a warp perspective back in a dark hole. Okay, so chop saw tip number 4 is to make a template for making repeatable parts. Now this is going to be more applicable to smaller pieces. It's harder to make a template for really long pieces. The other alternative to making a template is to make a backstop, but I personally don't like making stop blocks for 2 reasons. The first one is, especially with high-speed chop saws like this, I feel like they tend to jump back at you. What happens is when your saw cuts through that last sliver of material, your ejecting piece is stuck between your stop block and that saw blade and wants to fall and pinch and jam up, and then that piece goes flying. Now there are ways to minimize that, but I just like to avoid it completely. The second reason is a repetitive use of a stop block or backstop. If it is not secured properly and you don't continually check it, it could go out of tolerance from beating up against it, hitting your stop, and you're 30 or 40 cuts down the road and you don't realize that your stop has moved. You've just wasted a ton of time and maybe a ton of material. Okay, so what I like to do to make a quick template is actually cut my first piece out. So let's just say that I want a 4-inch long square cut. After you make your square cut, you're going to come over to your handy dandy belt sander that you built from leftover table saw parts. Video link in the description. And we're just barely going to deburr it, not really take any material off, just take any of the sharp edges that might impede our accuracy of our measurement. Then we're going to go down to our junk drawer where you keep all of your random flat little pieces of metal for making tabs or whatnot. We're going to throw a couple strategic tacks on here, meaning 2 things. One, you do not want to have a tack or any weld inside of the fillet area in here, because that's where your tube is going to be butting up against that you're going to be cutting. And 2, you want them in easy to access places so you can cut this piece off and still use this piece of material for your project in the end. So now that we have our template made, we can simply go over to our saw, slap our template up against the piece, bring our blade down, rest the template up against the blade, tighten her up, and cut our part. With just using your finger as a reference, you don't have to put a stop to make a template. You can deburr your piece. A lot of times this is what I actually do anyways, because I don't take the time, if I'm not doing a whole bunch of them, to go this far. But I'll just put my finger up against it as a template, set it down, lock it down, and cut it again. Okay, so the 5th and final chop saw tip that I frequently use is what I call a rotational reference line. This especially applies to round tubing. Now sometimes you have a factory rotational line, which is the weld seam. If you're using DOM tubing, it doesn't quite work for you. If you're using square tubing, you can just run your finger as a guide. If you're using round tubing, you can take a piece of angle iron, set it on there, and make a quick scribe. But what this does is it doesn't necessarily apply to if you're sitting there with a cutlass cutting things out but this is going to apply to the people that are making custom fit parts. And I do this a lot at work, where you go from the saw to the part you're working on, you turn around, and you have to make a Sharpie adjustment. You're not necessarily making a clear 22-degree miter cut. You are chopping a little bit off. Maybe you're not even using your chop saw. Maybe you're using the portaband. But in any case, you are incrementally coping this tube into its desired position. But what this rotational reference line does is give your brain something to lock onto. If your brain doesn't have that line to reference, when you go from the project you're working on to turning around, and your miters are supposed to be 90 degrees to each other, but then by the time you turn around, you don't remember if it's 90 degrees from this side of the miter or 90 degrees from this side of the miter. A complete 180 degrees off. So that's another quick little trick that's saved me so much time on just being able to be accurate and efficient. Just a simple little reference point for your brain to key off of to let you know whether you need to rotate it this way or that way. So once again, guys and gals, thanks for watching AM Custom Fab. If you want to see more fabrication content, click some of the links that are going to pop up here. If you want to be notified of upcoming videos, hit that subscribe button and click the little bell. It's free to do so, and go build something. Why are you still here? The next video is right there. You gotta click it to be able to watch it. I can't do that for you. Why haven't you clicked it yet? Suit yourself.